Welcome back, everybody, to the Now Morning Show here on TTT. Remember, we are also live on Talk City 91.1 FM and on Facebook at TTT Live Online. So the Tobago Writers Guild will be having their monthly lecture series on the 11th of this month at the Mitchell Gift Auditorium's Cabra Library over there in Tobago, and the conversation is going to surround reparations. And we have with us the featured speaker for this event, Mr. Kafra Cambon, who is the chairman of the Emancipation Support Committee. He is in studio with us here, and we have joining us via Skype Mr. Rodney Pigott. And we want to find out more about this conversation. Mr. Pigott, let me start with you to tell me, why are we focusing on reparations now?
Good morning, Richie. Well, reparations has always been a focus of Africans in the diaspora. So it's not a now conversation. It's been going on for a while. It's actually the first time in Tobago that the conversation is being put on the front burner. As you know, tomorrow starts our Heritage Month here in Tobago, which dovetails into Emancipation Day on August 1st. So having this conversation at this time is very apropos.
Mr. Cambon, what would be the message then that you want to get out there when you speak at this lecture series, given that the topic is reparations?
Well, I think the one critical message is that people need to understand that reparations is due to Africans and why. And the other thing is that for people to overcome the feeling that reparations is something which is far-fetched and somehow it is a battle that will never be won. So I want people to have a sense that it is a battle that will certainly be won. It is something critical for all of humanity, that reparations for the period of the slave trade, chattel slavery, it's very critical.
Mr. Cambon, I want to jump in a little bit. Some may argue that, slavery happened 400 years ago to the slaves, and we, in this age now, have been born in freedom. Some may ask the question, why should we get reparations at this point?
The first thing is that it didn't happen as long ago as you think, because I remember that you had a debate in the US Senate recently, and you saw Danny Glover was moved almost to tears. He almost broke down and cried, because once he started to talk about reparations, and that brings up the area of enslavement, his grandmother was an enslaved person, and he knew her in life. So it's not that far away. And even if you come to the Caribbean, and the people, the islands that were British, that is, not the Spanish and the French who came later on, but if you come to the British, and it ended here in Trinidad and Tobago in 1838. So that is not that long ago. But reparations is something that is not only given to the immediate victims. And that is why the term reparations is important, because the legal criteria and the just criteria is that as long as the descendants of those who committed the act continue to benefit from it, and those who suffered as a result of the act continue to suffer the consequences, then reparations is due. And that is the judgment of the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, and I want to get Mr. Pigott in on this conversation, and just to somewhat piggyback off what Carrie asked about, why is it that we have to give it now? Because pretty much you weren't a slave, or you weren't under attack at that point. So people would argue that, you're basically living off the work of other people, and probably you should be able to, create your own.
Well, that's like saying, to a man with no boots, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The fact of the matter is that the benefits of the enslavement of my ancestors is still being enjoyed by those who enslaved my ancestors. And by those, I mean specifically the governments of these nations. reparations is not targeting individuals. And this is where usually the pushback comes from, is that people feel that their personal wealth and their personal accumulation is going to be taxed somehow to pay or to recompense the descendants of those who were enslaved. But reparations actually targets the governments of the nations that are still benefiting, still have the wealth from the enslavement of my Africans. When you look at the fact that after the British converted the physical enslavement into colonialism, that they rubbed salt into the wounds of my ancestors by paying reparations to the plantation owners, who history shows and their documentation shows that those people are still some of the wealthiest people in England today, founding banks and insurance companies and so forth, on which the British Empire really still rests. So yes, reparations is due to the descendants of our African ancestors.
Mm-hmm. So what are we fighting for? Like in regards to reparations, what exactly do we believe, and what are we fighting for that the various governments of the countries or the powers that had engaged in the slave trade and whatnot, etc. What are we trying to get as reparation? What was the payment we're looking for?
Well, the CARICOM heads of state have formed a reparations committee, and they did in fact put together a 10-point demands, if you will, that we're looking to exact from the European nations. And most of those, if not all of them, are dealing more with social issues or educational issues or health issues, and of course, calling for the cancellation of all debts across the African nations. So many times when we hear the word reparations, people think of a check. I'm going to get a check. We're looking for money. While money is, of course, due, and one can make an argument and quantify that trillions of dollars is actually due the descendants of Africans in the Caribbean, we're looking more for infrastructure in terms of social, education, health, and so forth. So if one were to go to the CARICOM website, they will be able to view those 10 points. And perhaps Mr. Cambon could probably articulate some of those if he has that information.
Yeah, Mr. Cambon, what would you say is the main thing? I know we talked about infrastructure by Mr. Pigott there, but what would you say that is really needed for us?
Okay, well, you see, reparations, and I think it's important that he said it's just not a matter of a payment as such. There are certain objectives, and whatever it's going to take in terms of human resource, in terms of financial resources, whatever kinds of resources are needed in order to correct distortions that developed or were created by that system of enslavement. And I should say here that we almost always remember, in terms of CARICOM, the reparations is due for the indigenous people as well as for Africans. And I think one thing you have to get out of our head, Africans begging for money, as it's simplified, and the fact that reparations is nothing that started with us. Many peoples have received reparations because when a crime against humanity is committed, reparations is due. So that part of reparations is even our dignity as a people, that we could be what we have suffered, worst crime against humanity, and even for the sake of our dignity. But to come back to the other side of your question now, it is a question of what do we need? that is going to allow us to correct the distortions in our development. So you look at our development trajectory as a people. This has been completely distorted and has put us in a position of underdevelopment, and part of the underdevelopment is what has happened to us psychologically. So there's the material side, and there's the psychological side of it. And therefore, we have to make sure that we are in charge of the program of our development. Our responsibility as Africans, we want to go back, not go back, but we want to go forward to the point where we should have been based on our trajectory of development. We don't have all the resources to do that. And we have to deal with it from our own internal psychological level. And we have to deal with it where material resources are needed. Those have to come from those who put us into this position and who still have systems in place to keep us in the position that we are in.
Mr. Cambon, Chairman of the Emancipation Support Committee, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Also to Mr. Rodney Pigott joining us via Skype from Tobago for joining us this morning talking about reparations. Now, the Tobago Writers Guild monthly lecture series feature speaker is Mr. Kafra Cambon, and the lecture takes place on Thursday the 11th at the Anne Mitchell Gift Auditorium, Scarborough Library. Just, can you give me the time, Mr. Cambon?
I'm not sure of the
Mr.
time,
Pigott?
but ask Mr. Pigott for the time.
5:30 p.m.
5:30 p.m. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Important conversation to be had. We're going to take a break and come back with more. Stay with us.
Okay.